Okay, we're going to move into now a panel. As you can see, Karen's already set to go. Let me introduce the other two panellists and the chair. So panelist one, we've got Angus Bancroft. He's a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Edinburgh. His research has previously focused on the use of drugs, alcohol, addiction, and drug trafficking. His current research interest includes illicit markets and the views and experiences of darknet users, how individuals create security and trust in the darknet, and the complex role anonymity plays in these marketplaces. I asked him the other day if he has to do illegal things in order to do his research, and he kind of just smirked at me. So anyway, he's a very intriguing individual. Next, we've got Michael Movastaff. He's a professor of AI at the University of Edinburgh and director of the Bayes Centre, the university's innovation hub for data science and AI. He also represents the university at the Alan Turing Institute down in London, the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. His research interests are in AI with a specific focus on multi-agent systems where either artificial or human agents collaborate or compete with each other. And finally, the chair of this panel is Nicola Osborne. She's the Creative Informatics Programme Manager, leading the delivery of the project in close collaboration with academic and research colleagues and engaging with creative industry organisations across the Edinburgh cluster. Since 2014, Nicola's been the co-investigator on the Managing Your Digital Footprint research and co-tutor of the Digital Footprint MOOC research he's published on and disseminated through Edinburgh Fringe performances. An absolutely brilliant panel coming up for you guys right now. Please give them a big round of applause.
Hi there. Thank you so much to Karen for that intro. I think it sort of set the scene brilliantly for just how dark some of these data issues can get. Just you've got faces to put with the names. This is Michael Rovatsos and Angus Bancroft, and obviously Karen, who met. So we're going to talk about some of the issues around dark data, and I know over the last couple of days we've had lots of tweets and lots of questions on Slido about ethical implications and where things can go wrong. And this is your panel for only talking about that. So I think I wanted to start because Karen's given such a vivid insight into kind of a creative way to explain what's taking place. I was wondering if maybe Michael and Angus also wanted to talk about ways in which you can see there being a need for creatives to bring a perspective into this space, into the kind of tech and data space, and what they can maybe do with that. Maybe starting with Michael.
So this was really a fascinating kind of summary of what I would have required 2 hours of dry lecturing to explain. And I think what's becoming obvious is that the way data is used, the way biases are propagated through data, the way we are encoding actually social objectives into algorithms, sometimes without even knowing it, and the way that's done by those in power, the kind of the data billionaires, if you like, of the world, whether they are governments or big tech companies. We're all now aware of these problems, and I think what we haven't had time to process as a society is how we experience that, how we respond to that. And I think that's where I see the role of creatives. I think I've spent a lot of time in my research trying to explain to people, to normal citizens, whatever that is, how algorithms work, how data works, to kind of try and empower them and help them be informed and empowered participants in that debate. And it's incredibly hard. And I think creative people have a massive role to play in how we experience the issues, how we can, without kind of diluting or oversimplifying this complex word of technology and power, I think that's where they can really contribute to that debate.
Yeah, and we heard, Angus, in your intro that you lots of work with this sort of dark web, and there's a sort of creativity in evading some of these technologies, absolutely, which I think is quite fun. Yeah. So what are your thoughts in terms of how creatives and the sort of training the world needs to understand this stuff, how that kind of fits together?
Yeah, well, I think, taking on what both Michael and Karen have said, and in my work, we look a lot at the way in which drug users and people in illicit markets innovate around drug use. So they create new communities, they create new ways of using drugs, and they create new methods for reducing the harms from drugs. And often these innovations are pathologized in public discourse and discussion. And they're seen simply as ways of evading law enforcement surveillance, for example. And I think one thing that creatives can be really helpful in is working actually with the innovations people introduce, recognizing them, and depathologizing that. So creating a voice for people in marginalized communities of all sorts, not merely illicit drug users, and also ones who can, I think, tackle some of the ways in which established ideas of, say, innocence and guilt, responsibility and liability are being challenged by the introduction of intelligence-led policing, smart law, and so on. For example, I'm often asked, as Gemma did, whether I've ever done anything illegal. And the answer to that is I don't know, because you can commit crimes without being aware of it. So, for example, illegal images can be encoded in the Bitcoin blockchain. So you can receive, without knowing it, say an image of child pornography, which is a strict liability offense. There's no defense to that. It doesn't matter what your intention was. So we can be criminalized without even being aware of it. And I think another role creators can usefully have is introducing the right to be unknown, the right to opacity, and the right to obfuscate, and the right to be forgotten as well. So transactions that take place through the Bitcoin blockchain, that might be the exchange of illegal goods and services, can be recorded and are kept forever. It's a public document, a public record. You might, say as a young student, buy some illicit drugs for the weekend today. It'll be forgotten about, you hope, but in 10 years' time, the methods for investigating, for de-anonymizing will be so sophisticated that can be very easily traced. So there's a danger there in the memory of the digital that we can look at.
It's a really interesting link between what we were talking about before in terms of putting things into the archive and some of the issues that come up around that in the previous session. Mm-hmm. Karen, the stuff that you're doing with kind of particularly the kind of interactive, AI-informed policing things, how disquieting is that to take part in? I had a little look of people trying it out, and it looked like it's quite a disquieting experience, actually. Like, is that an important way to reach people, to make them really kind of question their assumptions and their biases? Does that work really well for them?
Yeah, traditional conversations, it's been proven that storytelling is more effective at connecting and changing people's minds than just traditional conversations. And I want to put people in the center of a visceral experience, because like when you go home from here and you're talking to your partner, you're going to be saying, oh, this made me feel like this, and oh, you won't be saying, oh, that information was really exciting. You know, it's what is connecting with you on an emotional level. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing. But I'm also very conscious of my responsibility as an artist, that I have an objective. I want to make you more conscious of your subconscious behavior, or more aware of your bias. It's not just titillation. Yeah. We're in this together. And what happens is that people tend to tell me afterwards that they start to have this neurological kind of process that happens in their brain, and that they're very much affected. And it's a very positive thing, because I work with neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, to make sure that we're on this journey with you, and we want to kind of empower you in this process. Yeah.
And you've been working with some companies to kind of build this into their sort of training for how to do their work, haven't you?
Well, I've been working with ThoughtWorks. It's a technology company, and they're a technology company that has strong ethics, and they feel they have a responsibility with technology. So they work with artists to explore issues through technology that maybe they haven't got the opportunity to do in their day-to-day roles. Yeah. And then they share these findings and information that they have through our work. They filter that back into their commercial business.
I think that's really interesting. I know one of the questions that's just come in on Slido was about if someone was to leave this conference and go and write national AI ethics training standards, what would you want them to take away from the conference, which is a really good question. And I know that idea of kind of what is the guidance that you give, particularly kind of commercial context. So some of the questions that have come up in the last couple of panels have particularly been about kind of commercializing data and commercializing bodies and commercializing that side of things. So yeah, what are the kind of the ways of making that
at the moment
work
that I'm aware of? There's no AI governance, there's no AI transparency, there's no AI regulation. So people are creating like this like a black box of code, and that is continuing to teach itself. And that's really dangerous, you know? So we need to have like AI governance, we need to have AI transparency, we need to be aware of what people are coding. Yeah. Because at the moment, if I came across like a racist cop, I can have a conversation. If I come across a biased AI, there's no conversation to be had.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to pick that up.
Well, I mean, I think what we're experiencing right now is when I talk to lots of businesses, and there is kind of this almost like a hype around ethics, and that's kind of linked to this idea that the ethics issue in AI needs to be addressed, can be addressed, and then it's going to be solved. It will never be solved. What we are doing now is we're doing, for the first time in human history, encoding politics and social process in technology on a massive scale. And I thought what you said about storytelling and its impact is very interesting, and it's very interesting in relation to our notion of democracy. So in some ways, creative processes are the most biased processes. They're highly personal, highly subjective, and people have very individual ideas that are closely linked to their own experiences. And that's not a million miles away from how the tech giants of today started out in the depths of the summer of love on the West Coast, being, idealists that wanted to democratize everything and everybody should have a voice. But that's what that's turned into is a very quantified notion of democracy where, we count clicks and likes. And in some ways, that's, of course, completely open, but they ignored the notion of power. They ignored the fact that whoever owns the data, whoever drives opinion, can manipulate that open process. So I think where the creative industries are extremely important is in actually teasing out a million strongly biased and personal views rather than introducing a systemic bias that is managed by some algorithmic process and actually implicitly encodes the vested interests of just a single big powerful entity.
Yeah, and that sort of links, I know, some stuff that you're very interested in, Angus, about sort of how AI and how some of this use of data impacts on kind of labour and production and the kind of who makes things and who gets to make things and who gets to have rights in that sort of space.
Yeah, that's right. And there's always an interface between the human and the machine, of course, and that's often where we get real issues around human rights and around the exploitation, for example, of digital labor that happens around the world. And I think what we need to do also is perhaps look a little bit upstream as well, because problematic AI might be built around different business models that might encode very highly exploitative understandings of user data, for example, in them. So I think we need to look a bit up and downstream. We need to look at the human, and also we need to look at the level of how our economy is organized. And what we can do is look as well at the way in which ethics are embedded in all these decisions. Economies, for example, aren't just naturally occurring entities. They're ethical and culturally informed processes. And we can look at the cultural norms that people bring to them about, for example, what value is, where it comes from, what exploitation means, what are the limits beyond which people won't go. And we can see that in illicit markets just as we can in, say, the stock market in London or in Frankfurt.
Yeah. So I know we've talked a bit about sort of some of the biases I've hit, and I know one of the questions that's come up just here is a thing that's been recurring across Beyond, which is that just because we can use AI, should we? And someone's asked, what does the panel feel about this? And I bet it's not going to be one thought in one context, but maybe do you want to sort of respond a little bit to that idea of kind of when it is an appropriate sort of thing to apply, and maybe how we start to form ways of understanding when it's not appropriate. I know some of the other questions that have come up over the last couple of days have been around the environmental impact of kind of large-scale computation as well. So the kind of ethics being not just about the kind of personal data, but also about the impact on the world. So yeah, I don't know, where would your boundaries be of when should we be using AI? Should it just be in provocations, or should we be using it in other places?
The bottom line is it really doesn't matter what we think, because we have no control over that at the moment. So we could philosophize about that as much as we want, but we're not in control of it.
No.
But that's why it's important to democratize it, so that we can come to the party.
Yep.
Right. So with the compass system, that looks at how persons for the criminals, it suggests to the judge how long someone should be in prison, and it looks at their past track record, and it looks at other factors which may encourage them to offend again, and it biases against that. When I spoke to a TechNet activist about my system, they said, hey, we could use a reverse of Compass. We could program into the data, what happens if that person had a support network? What happens if this person had a job? What happens if this person had mentors? What is the likelihood of them not reoffending? So it's a case of we have to take action and democratize this shit. Otherwise, because I could sit and go, oh, they shouldn't use it for this, they shouldn't use this. Unless we're using it how we want, we have no control over what we're doing. We're not part of that party.
So I think, I have some, I think the notion of democratizing things is a difficult one because, you could argue that, that's always the argument of the market, right? Businesses will say, we just put things out there and we're just using the things that are most popular, right? So I think what we mean by democratizing is actually something quite complicated, which is around collective reflection, deliberation and decision-making based on using actual expertise and insight. So if we look around us in this room, for example, most of even the simple materials, the glass, the table, and so on, all of that is regulated, right? AI isn't.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
I think we should, as a society, generally, this is no different from AI than it is from trains or airplanes or nuclear power stations, only use things that are safe. Now, if we don't have the institutional scaffolding, the democratic decision-making process, the validation, testing, monitoring of this safety, we shouldn't use it. I've done AI for 20 years, but luckily it was never actually working, so we didn't have this problem. So that was a great luxury we have no longer.
That's one to tweet, by the way.
I'm not speaking for others, by the way. I don't want to insult people on their research. Mine didn't work. So I think we shouldn't get caught up in a hype where we're thinking AI is a thing, it's there, everybody's using it. We should apply the same rigor that we do to anything else. Yeah. We say, how clean is our water? How good are plastic cups? It's the same with AI. We should not just let people, and the tech industry, unfortunately, is a spoiled industry, an unregulated industry that always has used this argument of, government shouldn't stifle innovation by introducing regulation, but we know in many other business sectors that innovation works just fine. Despite regulation, it just makes sure people aren't harmed or killed or discriminated against.
And it's a little bit more serious than plastic cups.
It is, potentially.
Yeah.
Yes.
In some ways. But there's no regulation, we're agreeing there's no regulation, transparency or governance over any of it.
Yeah. Now, I realise that we're going for the scary end of the dark data stuff because we want to scare you, so you go and think about it rigorously and apply your critical questioning. But I know in the conversations that Angus and I had ahead of the panel was about how often things look like they're automated when they're not, and that sometimes things that look like they're AI are it's almost like a marketing thing for tech companies and stuff. So I don't know if there's anything else about kind of the that's automation versus, not, the degree to which that's actually very unclear sometimes.
Of course, yeah. Dumb things can be very smart, and AI can be used as a talisman and a selling point, of course, without really any thought going into what that actually means or whether it's even needed, even in a very sort of straightforward financial sense. Something that we've looked at a lot is how ideas of human rights can be embedded in the everyday practice of drug-using communities and how they are valued and promoted. And the threats that come from, say, mass automated swamping of those communities, sometimes by hostile actors and sometimes as a kind of law enforcement disruption technique. And that can be driven by a sort of very simple AI method. And that can actually create very direct harm, destroying trusting relationships and creating really serious knock-on effects for people's health, people's ability to account for their own drug use, people's ability to speak about it and give voice to it. And I think there we can see where you should have a set of principles about how AI is embedded into practice of key agencies, such as different policing agencies, such as the security service, such as the state as well, which is important there.
So I know there's two questions that have come in that I feel like
Can I
kind
just
of related
also ask you quickly your question in reverse?
Yeah, absolutely.
I did a talk, not the same talk as this, but like a year ago, with someone, and I met them recently, like 3 months, and they went, oh my God, your talk, I couldn't believe what happened. I said, what happened? And they said, they contacted their insurance company because they had an issue with their healthcare, but they were doing it online and they were communicating with the person. And they were talking for ages and ages and ages. And then they realized that they were talking to a bot. And they realized because then they got flashback to my talk because I was talking about that. And what had happened is that when they were communicating, it was like responding exactly back to them. Like when they were making a joke, it was making a joke back. But when they were being sarcastic, it just didn't know how to respond. And the first time she was like, that's really weird. You know, I thought I had a good rapport with this person. And the second time when she did something sarcastic, I didn't know how to respond. She goes, oh shit, I'm talking to a bot. Like, oh my God. And she just like dropped the call. So it's sometimes you're not even aware that you are actually engaged in the interaction with the AI.
This brilliantly preempts the question I was actually about to ask,
Oh,
which is
perfect.
how do you not use AI? Because quite often you don't know that you're engaging with it. So,
You don't know.
yeah.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. You don't know if you are or if you aren't sometimes.
I mean, the other thing I would say is that, AI is an incredibly loaded term with lots of expectations and futuristic, speculative connotations and so on. The reality is that, most of the things we are exposed to are pretty much statistical data analytics things that, are nowhere near anything that could lay any claim to intelligence, right? It's just the data analysis. The things that we see and that are closer to AI that involve some sort of autonomy are, to some extent, chatbots and dialogue, machine translation and these sorts of things, robots, and image recognition. That's it. AI, in the narrow sense of the term, can't really do much more, right? All the things we worry about are about how humans and their organizations use mostly relatively mundane technology. It's about the use, not so much as the AI. So for example, the black box example, that's just laziness because people prefer to use a black box technique because it's easy. They don't have to. It doesn't necessarily do anything better than other techniques that you could query. So it's also about not limiting the issue to AI. A lot of it is actually about business ethics. A lot of it is about public policy and the wider ethical behavior of actors in the public space.
I think there's a lot of assumption as well that it's the tech sector that is the one that doesn't do any of this stuff, but it's obviously across all sectors, including, of course, the creative industries, to be thinking about what are the ethical implications and what are the kind of possibilities of what might happen.
And a lot of the ethical issues, they would be just the same if you used something else instead of it's not, the ethics isn't necessarily caused by the nature of the algorithm.
No. Well, in lots of cases, it's training data too. So I know in terms of so in the presentation from Karen, the soap dispenser, right? That's training data, right? So they haven't trained it with the right kind of data. And it seems obvious that actually there's a need for kind of diverse training data of all kinds. A lot of the kind of machine vision data is based on white faces. It's based on undiverse data. Should we be creating, I don't know, some kind of democratic kickback training data sets or something? Is that one of the ways that we might address some of those kind of biases later on?
I think this comes back to this governance, transparency, and regulation kind of answer. But then even if we did create this universal, diverse data set, people would have to then, I don't know if we could make them use it and impose it upon them unless it was part of a regulation or governance of the system.
And who would you trust to create that? Right?
Well,
do we actually trust each other?
Yeah, so one of the questions from the audience that has just come in, by the way, I'm loving Slido because I've been watching the Twitter and the bots on Twitter have been sharing so much porn, which seems so appropriate at this panel, but so annoying. So the Slido is lovely for the questions. One of the questions that's come in on that is, what are the new social institutions we actually need to be the regulators of this? And where one of the issues here is that this is a global issue and not at sort of nation-state legislation level. So we can fix this in like 8 minutes or something, right? What do we think? What are the new social institutions that we need? I mean, is it about people power? Is it about actually creating a kind of formal structure or social institution to do this? Is there anything we can do in the creative industries in the UK, make something kind of more contained that might do that? What do we think? Who's game?
I'll leap into that. I think the challenge, and this isn't an answer, it's more problems, but the challenge is with creating any institution, you have the danger of capture and by industry, by whoever, in ways that aren't necessarily very helpful. And I think that's always going to be the difficulty. So the way of dealing with that is embedding a continual dialogue around this. And I think, we sort of focus on AI as, oh, it's a big problem and it's a big threat. Well, these issues are political, and they're about many other things as well. So that is something that needs to be done in a very lateral way that needs lots of different voices in it. And I want to give a positive example as well here. I work on digital development in South Africa, and one marginalized community we work in has a real problem with fire. And part of the reason is the government won't allow anything more than a single water standpipe to serve thousands and thousands of people. They won't allow proper infrastructure, smart or dumb. And an insurance company installed wireless smoke alarms, fire alarms there, which have really helped reduce the incidence of fire, not because the fire brigade turn up, because people are in the community know what's happening, and they can rush and help other people and sort things out much more quickly. Now, that's not an ideal solution. The ideal solution would be to have a proper infrastructure there. But that is a way of highlighting how we can actually use these systems to work and support communities themselves.
Yeah. Karen?
Yeah, lateral. It's all about being independent and creating our own networks. We need to kind of move away in all these technologies to more democratic formats. Like social media, for example, is like almost the starter to AI, and that's really designed, we can see, to kind of get us addicted to it, and now it's influencing us and influencing people with elections or Brexit. So
we've gotten so far without mentioning Cambridge Analytica.
I'm so sorry. I'm British. It's like in my DNA now. So that's kind of that's like baby compared to the potential of AI and how these things can be exploited and against us in different ways. So we need to create our own networks, need to create our own governance, need to create our own independent processes.
Yeah.
I think there's something around, I think the social media example is a good one, because there are things that are not, actually a lot of the thing, in many ways, business interests around competition and openness of markets coincide with the interests of the public. So for example, there is no reason why something like Facebook couldn't be open. Right? Anybody could host their own social network and connect to each other. There is no technical reason whatsoever, right? So it's only market power that drives this and actually keeps other businesses from getting in there. So I think, but I think my main concern is that we lack the maturity as a society to deal with these issues, and I think one of the reasons is basically the lack of education. I don't know if you.
I don't know. Sorry, I'll let you.
So if you look at our politicians,
slight heckle. We've got just enough time.
No, I'm sorry. I'll let you go on. I should let you finish, otherwise it's rude.
So what I mean by that is that you hear in many situations when they're publicly speaking, our politicians talk about these things, and you clearly realize that they haven't grasped the complexity. It's a bit like what happened on financial markets, right? So you invent a global system of finance, then you think, well, it's all fine, and then you have flash crashes and financial crises and so on, because nobody's able to think about how it should be regulated globally. And we haven't managed it there, and I think data is the next frontier where we're not managing that. So I think, from my personal point of view, this is another area where I think creative people can help a lot, because they create ways for people to experience and understand these issues that you can't just do with an infomercial.
Yeah, so I don't think the answer is we lack the maturity, or the answer is in education.
Institutional.
I feel like, sorry, say that again?
Institutional. I don't think we as individuals lack the maturity.
Oh, but you mean
I think as a society, in terms of our institutions and the mechanisms we have for governance, we're not ready to deal with it very well.
Yeah, I would say then the mechanisms.
Yes.
Because us as people, there's independent-minded people who have lots of answers, and we need to create independent networks together. And they don't always come from traditional forms of education.
Oh,
Okay, so on that note, and knowing that we want to leave you not too depressed with the dark data, I'm going to ask you to do in like 20 seconds each, I've got exactly a minute left, what is the like one thing you would like to see creative people do to make this better? Karen.
Well, there's no one way to skin this cat. I feel a responsibility, so this is like my life. So for creative people, if it connects with them, but I don't want to limit it. It's like everybody has creativity inside of them. For everybody here to be creative, I don't want to just limit it to creative people.
Great. Angus?
I think make sure that and it's a way of bigging up yourself a little bit. Some of the issues we talk about are downstream of culture. Culture frames what we're doing and frames our way of thinking. So creating ways in which we can think creatively and differently about this is going to be absolutely beneficial.
Michael?
Yeah.
Create opportunities for people to be inquisitive and reflect their own experiences of the data world. I think this personal experience thing is extremely strong when it's powered by creative experiences.
Awesome. Thank you so much for our fantastic panel and for your fantastic questions.
Thank you.